Do you want me to hold the book open?
No, I want you to tell me, what is the Negro Revolution?
Are we advertising for you?
Are you advertising for me? Why do you ask that?
I don't want to be a paid promotion.
What you're
Are
going
you
to be?
filming?
What you're going to be is a student.
Okay.
What is the Negro Revolution?
The Negro Revolution is a series of nonviolent direct action protests in nearly 1,000 cities that started in 1963.
Who led the Negro Revolution?
Martin Luther
MLK
King.
led the Negro Revolution.
And who is Dr. Martin Luther King?
He's a nonviolent warrior fighting against segregation in America.
That is correct. So a nonviolent warrior leading a nonviolent direct action protest in nearly 1,000 cities that started in 1963, you would think that is a legacy we would all know about, right? Did he write a book about it?
Yes.
Yeah, he did.
What's the name of the book?
Why We Can't Wait.
Why We Can't Wait. What's the first chapter titled?
The Negro
Revolution.
Revolution. Why
Why
1963?
Why 1963?
Because that was 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation.
That is
And
correct.
the slaves were free, but they still didn't have equal rights.
Did the
Even after
Emancipation
100
did the
years.
Emancipation Proclamation free the slaves?
No, they freed themselves by fighting in the war.
That is correct. Could the North have won the war without the slaves fighting for their own freedom?
Just to clarify, we're talking about the Civil War.
We're talking about the Civil War. How many revolutions have there been?
3.
3.
Name them.
The American Revolution, the Civil War, and the Negro Revolution.
That is correct. Which one of them was nonviolent?
The
Negro
Negro
Revolution.
Revolution.
Okay. Did it involve children?
It did.
Yes.
Ooh. Well, let's get to it. Read page 112.
All of it? Or
Start.
just, okay.
I'm sorry. What's going on over here?
Looking back, it is clear that the introduction of Birmingham's children into the campaign was one of the wisest moves we made.
Hold it. What is the campaign he's talking about?
Birmingham? Like, I don't know.
The campaign against segregation.
It is a campaign against segregation within the construct of what large-scale movement?
The Negro Revolution.
That's correct. That's what he's talking about.
So
Go
just
on.
one of those campaigns.
So it's introducing Birmingham's children was considered what?
Introducing, one of the wisest moves we made.
Wow. Okay. So children are part of this revolution.
Yes.
Go on.
It brought a new impact to the crusade and the impetus that we needed to win the struggle. Immediately, of course, a cry of protest went up. Although by the end of April, the attitude of the national press had changed considerably, so that the major media were according us sympathetic coverage. Yet many deplored our using our children in this fashion.
Did you hear that? The media deplored the use of children in the Negro Revolution. Why? Why? Why would you deplore? Why would you say it's a bad thing to use children in a direct action nonviolent protest? Why would you say it's a bad thing to do that?
I don't know.
Because they wanted them to stop using the children. But he said the children was what?
One of the wisest moves we
The
made.
wisest moves they made.
No.
Go on.
Where had these writers been, we wondered, during the centuries when our segregated social system had been misusing and abusing Negro children? Where had they been when their protective words when, down through the years, Negro infants were born into ghettos, taking their first breath of life in a social atmosphere where the fresh air of freedom was crowded out by the stench of discrimination? The children themselves had the answer to this misguided sympathies of the press. One of the most ringing replies came from a child of no more than 8 who walked with her mother on one day in a demonstration. An amused policeman leaned down to her and said with mock gruffness, "What do you want?" Child looked into his eyes, unafraid, and gave her answer, Freedom, she said. She could not even pronounce the word, but no Gabriel trumpet could have sounded a truer note. Even children too young to march requested and earned a place in our ranks. Once we sent out a call for volunteers. 6 tiny youngsters responded. Andy Young told them that they were not old enough to go to jail, but that they could go to the library. You won't get arrested there, he said, but you might learn something. So these 6 small children marched off to the building in the White District, where, up to 2 weeks before, they would have been turned away at the door. Shyly but doggedly, they went to the children's room and sat down, and soon they were lost in their books. In their own way, they had struck a blow for freedom.
Andy Young became an ambassador to the United States. So we're talking about people, leaders, from Dr. Martin Luther King to Andy Young to Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and more, who were putting their lives on the line. And they incorporated these children, and thousands of these children went to jail. But some were too young, and they sent them to the library. In a minute, we're going to watch a film that's going to show you what happened in 1963, not only to the adults, but even to children.
Looking back, it is clear that the introduction of Birmingham's children into the campaign was one of the wisest moves we made. Serious as they were about what they were doing, these teenagers had that marvelous humor that arms the unarmed in the face of danger. Under their leaders, they took delight in confusing the police. A small decoy group would gather at one exit of the church, bringing policemen streaming in cars and on motorcycles.
Okay, hold on. They gathered where?
At the exits of churches.
So we know that children were involved. We know that churches were involved. Go on.
Also teenagers. I guess they count as children.
Before the officers knew what was happening, other groups, by the scores, would pour out of other exits and move, 2 by 2, toward our goal in the downtown section. Many arrived at their destination before the police could confront and arrest them. They sang as they marched and as they were loaded into the paddy wagons. The police ran out of paddy wagons and had to press sheriff's cars and school buses into service.
So you know what a paddy wagon is? It's basically when instead of having a police car, because you got too many people you're arresting, you put them inside of basically, back then, they didn't call them SUVs, but they were covered trucks or a van. And the reason they called them paddy wagons is it's actually a derogatory term, which we do not use. And but back then, it was a term that they used for those.
Paddy wagon?
Where you put a lot of folks into the back of a vehicle, a van or a truck that is a police vehicle, and they called it a paddy wagon, and that's a reference to the Irish. But we do not call them paddy wagons. They were police vehicles, and they put a lot of folks into these police vehicles. So when you see that term paddy wagon, don't use the term. Call it police vehicle.
Watching those youngsters in Birmingham, I could not help remembering an episode in Montgomery during the bus boycott. Someone had asked an elderly woman why she was involved in our struggle. "I'm doing it for my children and for my grandchildren," she had replied. 7 years later, the children and grandchildren were doing it for themselves.
Now stop right there. He's referring back. That's a
Rosa Parks?
when Rosa Parks, exactly, when she was arrested in Montgomery, it was Dr. King that led the Montgomery bus boycott. And so black people for an entire year did not take the bus. They walked wherever they needed to go. And most of the riders of the buses, the public system in Montgomery, were black people. Because white people had their own vehicles, they could go this place and that place. Black people had to take the bus. And so by boycotting the buses, they had an economic impact on Montgomery. But it still took a year before they finally relented, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Now, that being said, they won that bus boycott, but he's reflecting back on a conversation he had with a grandmother back during the Montgomery bus boycott.
It wasn't him. It said someone had asked an elderly woman.
Oh, good point. So he's reflecting back on that conversation that happened in 1956. So this now, in the present day of this book, is what year?
What do you mean?
He's reflecting back in 1956, but the day that he's talking about in Birmingham
It's 1963.
is 1963. Okay, so read that again.
Watching those youngsters in Birmingham, I could not help remembering an episode in Montgomery during the bus boycott. Someone had asked an elderly woman why she was involved in our struggle. "I'm doing it for my children and for my grandchildren," she had replied. 7 years later, the children and grandchildren were doing it for themselves.
Wow. See, you teach the children, and they learn, and they become warriors in the struggle. Go on.
With the jails filling up and the scorching glare of national disapproval focused on Birmingham, Bull Connor abandoned his posture of nonviolence. The result was an ugliness too well known to Americans and to people all over the world. The newspapers of May 4th carried pictures of prostrate women and police bending over them with raised clubs, of children marching up to the bared fangs of police dogs.
Hold on. What does prostrate mean?
I don't know.
When someone lays face down, toes down, chest down, head down, face down, that is called prostrate. So imagine black women on the street, face down on the street, completely. And what does it say? Read the description again.
And policemen bending over them with raised clubs.
So what do you think was happening?
They were beating them.
They were beating these people. Go on.
Of children marching up to the bared fangs of police dogs.
Could you do that?
No.
I would if I had a bat.
Did these children have a bat?
No.
They had nothing.
Of the terrible force of pressure hoses sweeping bodies into the streets. This was the time of our greatest stress, and the courage and conviction of those students and adults made it our finest hour.
Could you imagine having that much courage
That's crazy.
to face police dogs, to face the striking police force where you're laying down in the street and they're just beating you with billy clubs, or spraying you with these 150 psi per square inch hoses that are just pulling you off of the wall and throwing you out into the street, or just ripping your skin off of you? Can you imagine that? That's what they were going through, just so that people would stop mistreating them. Go on.
We did not fight back, but we did not turn back. We did not give way to bitterness. Some few spectators who had not been trained in the discipline of nonviolence reacted to the brutality of the policemen by throwing rocks and bottles.
Now stop right there. Read that again.
Some few spectators who had not been trained in the discipline of nonviolence reacted to the brutality of the policemen by throwing rocks and bottles.
Notice that they had trained their marchers. And he talks about that in detail, what that training looked like and what they all had to pledge. So it was not an easy thing to march with Dr. King. Go on.
In the face of this resolution and bravery, the moral conscience of the nation was deeply stirred, and all over the country, our fight became the fight of decent Americans of all races and creeds.
Okay. So now we're going to see a short film. It's about 30 minutes.
You call that short?
It is.
Compared to what he always puts
It is
on.
most assuredly short. Okay? So now, what is the Negro Revolution?
The
A nonviolent direct action series of protests in about 1,000 cities that started in 1963.
Who led it?
Martin Luther King.
Who is Martin Luther King?
Martin Luther King was a non-violent warrior fighting against segregation in America.
That is correct. And the Negro Revolution, he said, was the third revolution in America. What were the other two?
The American Revolution, fighting for their independence against Great Britain, and the Civil War.
That is correct. And which of the three revolutions was nonviolent?
The Negro Revolution.
And the Negro Revolution had three demands. Do you know what they are?
End segregation in housing, banking, and schools.
In segregation in schools, that is correct. Indiscrimination in housing, that is correct. Indiscrimination in banking, that is correct. Do you know the conditions of all three of those today?
I don't.
Do you?
No.
They are all worse than they were in the 1960s.
How do you know that?
That's a good question. I'm going to show you the data.